Welcome, everyone. On this podcast today, we have Professor Luke O'Neill. And I'm super excited to welcome you, Professor, to this podcast because not only is it going to be about science in some areas that we've never covered on this podcast before, but also because it is such a huge topic that we're going to cover. Everything about where we are, where we're going to go, and the future of humanity is at stake here. So no pressure. A little bit about the professor. First of all, he's got an amazing TED Talk. If you haven't seen it, it's called "The Biggest Riddle of Them All: What is Life?" And that's kind of a little bit of I got some insights about Professor O'Neill. But he was educated at Trinity College, where he was awarded an undergraduate degree in natural sciences in 1985 in biochemistry. He completed his postgraduate study at the University of London, where he was awarded a PhD in pharmacology. And following his PhD, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Strangeways Research Laboratory in Cambridge, funded by the Medical Research Council. He's also the author of one of the best titled books I've seen in science, Never Mind the Bullocks, Here's the Science, which of course we'll cover briefly in this podcast. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Very happy to take part. And you mispronounced the word, it's bollocks.
Yes. I really struggle with that word. I'm not native to it.
Rude word in some circles, but in Ireland we use these words all the time. Nothing to worry about here.
And for the listeners and watchers of this podcast, you might notice that we have another guest, David Ola. And David Ola is one of our newest team members, and I will be introducing him a little later in the podcast. But he and the professor have an interesting background, which again, I don't want to spoil the surprise. But back to you, Professor. So first of all, one of the interesting things about anyone who's accomplished as much as you have is why they started down this path. And it's usually some really cool story about how they were inspired as a young person. Maybe you can tell us yours.
Yeah, well, I mean, I realized in my teens, I didn't want a regular job. Let's start with that, Carlos. I didn't fancy routine things at all for some reason. And I vividly remember when I was maybe 16 years of age, hearing about a thing called DNA in my biology class. And I'm not making this up. It sounds like a standard story, but our teacher in school really got me interested in DNA. And once I heard about this double helix and the wonder of life itself, the bug began to bite, I guess, And then beyond that, then I realized, look, if I became a scientist, I might make a discovery. Imagine discovering something that nobody's seen before. I thought, what a cool thing to do. So that was in my mind. And then I was I was going to do medicine actually initially, to be honest. And then I could have gone into medical school, but I just said, nah, I'd rather be a scientist. So I ended up going down the science road.
Well, it's funny. I almost thought I wanted to go to med school as well. And I did an internship in the Red Cross for a little bit. And the idea of all the pain that you have to sometimes help people go through, I just couldn't handle it. So I definitely can relate to that. So, you've had a long career, and actually it's very hard to try to summarize that very quickly, obviously, for the purposes of this interview. But one of the cool things is the summary of all that research into this book that you recently published. And you cover some really big questions. And I wanted to first of all ask you, the genesis of the book. I mean, most people come up with a reason why they've written books. I wrote a book about fundraising about 5 years ago, mostly because I was getting asked the same questions over and over again. I just want to understand why you wrote yours, and then we'll cover some of the questions you address in it.
Sure, guys. Well, I guess it's pretty simple. I was asked to write it. That's the first thing. So a publisher approached me. I have a radio slot on Irish radio once a week. It's gone to twice a week now because of COVID, actually. But for a number of years, I've been on this radio show, little science slot every week. And it went down well. And this publisher, Gil, said, how about writing a book based on your radio slot? So I wrote my first book. It was called Immunology. And then that sold quite well. And then I quite enjoyed writing it. Do another one, And then the second book is all about the big questions that we face in life, I suppose. And because I'm a scientist, I really believe in using science to help us. The great thing about science is it can help us in our lives, and how science informs these big questions. And I figured now more than ever, we need science. And I wrote the book pre-COVID, by the way. I got the proofs just when COVID was breaking. COVIDized it. I'll come back lots of reference to COVID in the book, but it wasn't written with COVID in mind. So the inspiration was sort of to allow, to reveal, I suppose, how great science is as a way to approach big questions, I guess.
And some of the big questions, I'm just going to read some out for you that you cover in the book. It's, do we have control over our lives? Can we escape working in bullshit jobs? Must we vaccinate our children? I love that one in particular. Are men and women's brains different? And will we destroy the planet? And some of these are scientific, some of them are existential, kind of like, can we escape working bullshit jobs? And it's almost like there's a range there between like philosophical and sort of factual. How did you manage to sort of deal with that breadth? Like that's a massive undertaking.
I guess each chapter I'm really interested in each topic myself. I've read lots about it over the years, and I realized, I could build a chapter around that topic. And of course, they are big questions like vaccines, as you've said, because it's the big one. Climate change, they're the two obvious ones that stand out. But the bullshit jobs one, it's always intrigued me why people do the job they do, and then how society has organized itself based on the work environment and so on. In fact, that chapter I wrote a fair bit about remote working, and this is pre-COVID, remember, that was happening already. So I guess that each of the chapters were things that intrigued me, I guess, and I knew a little bit about, I suppose. So like I'd done my research already, kind of thing. And then talking to friends and people, I said, would you find this interesting? And they all said, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, the men-women one is interesting. The actual title of that is, why do you still think men are from Mars and women are from Venus? So because our opinion has changed on that over the years, I guess. So I guess the bottom line for the book was things that were intriguing to me. And then secondly, you're right, some of them are less scientific and more philosophical maybe, but we're all asking ourselves these questions, aren't we? Because I suspect my mental age never went above 18 probably, when I was like, why am I here? Like I mentioned Nietzsche a lot, for instance, the teenager friend, so that was part of the motivation. And of course the great thrill is I can list my heroes, couldn't I? Each chapter had a bit of popular culture there. Like I'm a massive fan of the Beatles, for instance, so I have a chapter on drugs, so I was able to build that. Bill Hicks, another one of my heroes, so I can build all that stuff into it as well.
So, on the book side of things, I think you probably know of another author, Professor Jordan Peterson, who wrote this book, 12 Rules for Life, about a year ago or 2 years ago, bestseller at the time. And one of the chapters I think stood out as like the most obvious and yet the most simple solution to a lot of people's problems. And keep in mind, he wrote it from a point of view of like improving people's lives. It was around just make your bedroom, like make your bed. And the whole thesis was like, you start with something small and then it escalates, right? And if I were to ask you the same question, but in a slightly different sense, in a scientific sense, and I were to say to you, like, what's the one obvious thing that we as humanity should do scientifically that is so damn obvious when you hear it, and yet would have the biggest momentum build up to actually solving all of our problems? What would it be?
I was going to say brush your teeth, but that's probably too obvious. That's a tough question. I guess the essence of the book, in a sense, is using your reason, In other words, if we're just more reasonable, we'll get a lot further down the track, let's put it that way, And that's what science really is about, actually. It's about using data and using information and having a reasonable response. So, for example, if you read something in the media or on social media, take a step back and think, does this make sense? Is this a reasonable thing? And try to be reasonable about things. And certainly lean towards the liberal, shall we say. Cut the other guy a bit of slack. There's a rule of thumb for you, because
cut the other guys much
better if we cut each other, because life is hard for everybody, So don't be nasty, that kind of thing as well. But science can inform this, because, and let's talk about the great Tony Fauci. He seems to be the most famous scientist on the planet. All he says is follow the data. That's all he says, really, So that'll be my key piece of advice: follow the data, and you won't go far wrong.
Follow the data and be reasonable about other people's opinions. But therein lies another question, if I may, on your book still. I think one of the challenges that we have in modern day society is this emergence of sort of this postmodern thinking, this sort of like quasi, this is the reason why fake news can spread so quickly. How do you think as a society we can battle this temptation to go for the easy wrong and remain reasonable? How do we not fall victim to this sort of easy reasoning?
The one lesson that we all know at this stage is we're living in bodies and brains that evolved 200,000 years ago, remember, So we're inclined to have an instinctive response, which is often the wrong response. Things frighten us. We're inclined to be biased about certain things. We certainly, support our biases by selectively looking at information coming at us. And it's really difficult. It's like you want to go down to a fast food joint and stuff your face full of bad food. That's an evolved trait, remember? Because on the Serengeti, you stuffed your face full of antelope if you caught one, this kind of thing. So I think the story of human history actually is trying to defy these instinctive responses, you see. So, and then we've got to keep confronting that. And the way you confront it is through enlightenment. Let's put it that way, and using our reason and using scientific knowledge to defy what would be a natural response, and that might be the wrong response. So that's one quick philosophical answer to the question, I think. But again, it's about getting comfort, Carlos, in a sense, because the reason why science is so powerful, it gives us comfort. In other words, I know vaccines work. I can show you all the evidence. And I'm comforted by that scientific fact that vaccines are safe and that hopefully that they will be safe and that they will work. And if you're anxious about these things, follow the data, follow the science.
No, it's fair. And I think that maybe you summarized it well with this temptation that we have as humanity to go for the easy rather than the hard, which is effectively the way that the Enlightenment trajectory followed. And maybe that's a great segue to the next section of our chat, where I want to frame you as an investor. We were talking about this offline. One of the challenges investors have is falling into groupthink, falling into that sort of the easy wrong, because that's kind of what everybody's thinking, right? You would look at, I look back at 1920s popular science magazines, and they're hilarious because they got some things really right and some things really wrong. Yeah. One of the things that they got really right was this idea of like a video call, right? They had like a old TV with a phone, and then you could TV. So they got FaceTime right. But the funny thing was they had these flying vehicles, which were fine. Like we do have them now, but everyone, including the women, were wearing Victorian garb. So the idea that our clothing were not going to evolve at the same time that this technology was, like, it was just like this warped sense of like gender roles and clothing roles. And so we get a lot of these things wrong, and investors generally would have backed the wrong thing back then. And so now I'm going to put you in the hot suit of an investor. So as an investor armed with now 5 million, and I chose that number very carefully because I don't want it to be so big that it's daunting, but so small that it's useless. Which are the 3 areas you'd find startups to back right now, and why?
Oh, there's a great question. Because 5 million is not enough. That's the first problem, as you know. So you won't get very far.
Intentionally that size.
If you want to make a big impact, you won't get very. Sadly, when I tell lay people that these millions aren't that much, they kind of go, "What the hell are you talking about?" So, you're asking me which areas would we see coming down the pike? Well, obviously, medical advances. Clearly, there's a massive. You look where the biggest need is. I think you start with that. So the biggest need by far would be in new medicines, which is my own area, of course. So many diseases still cannot be treated. Massive unmet need, massive market potential. Let's start with that. And then the question becomes, how do you find, the right thing to invest in? And then you look at the people. It's obvious in a way, don't we? We all know this in spades. The idea is one thing, it's the nature of the person you're dealing with. And the interpersonal part of investment, in my opinion, in all our lives is so central, you see. So which part of medical research would you invest in? I would then look at the people that are presenting what their ideas might be. Certainly, it's obvious, again, we're looking at AI, the interface, aren't we, with living systems? These are obvious things. There's nothing innovative here. There's so many ideas out there, though. The question was, which one do you choose? Which one do you think is going to go furthest, I guess? And as an immunologist, invest in the immune system. That's the first clue I would give you, because we will find treatments for all these diseases through the immune system. It's happening already. Cancer, the big breakthroughs in immuno-oncology, as you know. My own business is anti-inflammatories for the big disease like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So use the immune system to go after these diseases. The second area to look at is definitely the brain, no doubt about that at all. We're so far behind in our knowledge of how the neurological systems operate. Like, we need new treatments for schizophrenia, psychosis, depression, all the big ones. Still, you'd be looking for innovative ideas there. That would be surely coming down the track. It's very challenging. And then related to that, this is off the cuff now, Carlos. I'm just giving you this randomly. Some of this could be wrong. Has to be medical devices that are interfacing with the human, no question. And we're talking transhumanism in a sense there. The future has to be soft electronics, sensing things, and then relaying information to something else, and then using that to make a therapeutic input, that kind of thing. So that interface is the big one I would be looking at closely.
Yeah, and you've created like a world of 5, 6, 7 different questions I want to ask you on the tail end of that. But staying strict to the theme, which areas do you think investors at the moment, from what you hear, are overfunding? And overfunding means they've now put so much money into that one of 2 negative outcomes can happen. Either one, there's massive disappointment from the point of view of the customer. Think Theranos. And 2, there is a regulatory clampdown because of negative consequences that sets the whole industry back 10 years.
Yep.
What areas would you say investors at the moment are overfunding?
Well, investors, as you well know, Carlos, I mean, me having helped venture capital funds of various kinds over the years, they do hunt in packs, remember, and they all go after the same thing, and they kind of nuance it slightly. But in fact, they're risk averse at one level, I've found, because they all, to try something really innovative is too risky, I suppose, And areas that are overdone, well, now let me think for a minute. I think the whole microbiome business has been overhyped for a long time. Now, there are some companies that do a good job there, and they're kind of looking at sub parts of that could be interesting. It's not as if they're all terrible, but that an awful lot of money went into that. I think that was wasted in a sense because it's far too complicated. It was too early, maybe, Of course, one example where there was years of money lost was gene therapy, but that's now delivering, as we all know. That suddenly got better. They all back CRISPR in spades. I'm waiting for the killer app there to be really proven. It may come. I don't know. The other big mistake that people made was investing in big data, especially in medical stuff, and that didn't yield either. The whole notion of genetics and the next one I'm going to speak to will know all about this, being a human geneticist. I mean, that was massively overhyped and didn't get anywhere largely. In my humble opinion, the DNA bit, which turned me on at the very start, it's a great tool to use for discovery, but it didn't really directly give rise to new breakthroughs as such, We've yet to realize the potential of that for some mysterious reason, Carlos. It hasn't delivered, So those genomics-based companies didn't really deliver. Antisense was a blowout, It just takes time, though, mind you. If you stick at some, monoclonals were like that for years. They spent a long time on those, not getting anywhere. And then finally, 30 years ago, began to yield, And now it's the biggest selling drug on record, those biologics. So it does take a bit of patience. But I don't know. It's hard to say if money's been wasted ultimately, because something's always learned, I think as well. You always get a few things come out of this. The other thing that happens, Carlos, in spades is, people are duped by flashy, bright, shiny things and big machines that do things. And like Theranos would be a good example, actually, And then investors get blinded for some reason. That's one to watch. The biggest message of all is don't believe your own bullshit,
There you go. For sure. Now, there's one thing that you mentioned earlier, though, about, and I'm segueing it from the whole bullshit thing, because we have seen a weird correlation between some innovation not coming from the traditional academic sources. And, you look at SpaceX, you look at Huel and Soylent in the US, and you look at some of the world's challenges, they're not done by the people who are doing the research. There's somebody who's like, there's a problem. I have no idea how I'm going to solve this. I'm just going to go. Right. And, some of the things that you mentioned seem maybe a little bit too difficult for somebody to do that. But what is your view on how you would expect non-orthodox innovation to come in the future? Is it just too far out of reach because it's so complicated? Or do you think that there is a correlation between somebody being so unplugged that they actually don't know the actual problems?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what you need is a maverick. That's the most important term I would use in this thing, because you need someone who is definitely different to the rest. Let's put it that way. Now, they're often academics because they have to hide away somewhere. They can't get a regular job, so they end up in university or whatever. That's one possibility, right? You've got to, and again, it's as you well know, Carlos, you're trying to get the interpersonal thing in a sense, aren't you? It's very hard to spot, isn't it? And it's rare, I suppose. But certainly, too much knowledge is a bad thing. Let's put it that way. And often academics get cut in the weeds, and they spend years working on one single thing, and I call that noodling. You want to avoid that for definite. I think what the thing to watch for here is a proof of concept getting quick at that. In other words, define what a proof of concept looks like and get there within a year or two. If it's dragging on, forget it. Is the thing that I would always use as a rule of thumb. And I think my own approach, I'm impatient in a sense. I want to see progress. Otherwise, I begin to lose interest. Maybe ADHD is the key trait to have in people. That's because one reason I became a scientist was new shit comes to light, to quote the Big Lebowski, all the time. It's great. There's new stuff, and I love that. So that's the kind of approach you need. But then eventually you got to deliver, though. You got to say, look, I've got an idea here. and I'm going to push it, and I'm going to try to come up with a way to test that idea fully, and then you might actually get somewhere. But you do need to be, like the best example I often give is stomach ulcers, and this guy Barry Marshall was pressing Helicobacter, and nobody believed him. They thought that ulcers were a middle-aged guy. He couldn't meet his sales targets. He was drinking too many martinis, and he got an ulcer. It's not. It's a bacteria in your gut that causes ulcers, you see. And Marshall drank it himself famously and gave himself an ulcer, and he was able to treat that with antibiotics. And the big advances often happen by that kind of strange, maverick who's a bit loose and will take it. Certainly wants to defy the regulations. Let's put it that way. Without if you stick to the rules, you're not going to get anywhere. That's the other thing you want to watch, really.
All right, so definitely somebody who doesn't stick with the rules, who's a maverick and has some elements of ADHD.
Exactly.
Okay, that brings me to David. That brings me to introducing David Ola.
Yes. What a great segue.
What a great segue. So, as I mentioned before, David is one of our newest team members at Seedcamp. Excellent background, which I am not going to spoil. I'm going to let him share with you, but very relevant. And the surprise relationship between Professor O'Neill and David is that they work together in the sense that Professor taught him. David went to the same school where Professor is teaching, and that's how the connection came about. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, David, and David's going to not only walk through some of the elements of the questions that he has for Professor, but also his background. On to you, David.
Yeah, so I have a, kind of like an unorthodox background into startups, but I think start with my journey in Trinity, where I was studying human genetics, and actually, one of my first lectures was with Professor O'Neill, so that's where that connection comes. But about 2 years into my studies at Trinity, me and a co-founder saw an issue that we really wanted to solve, typical startup story. Saw an issue, we looked at the market, this market being healthcare-acquired infections, and we saw there was a huge issue and there weren't that many solutions on the market, if any at all, really, directly solving it. And we decided to research, and we formulated a chemical, which when you add to disinfectant and you apply it to a surface, will give you a visual indication of the group of pathogens on that surface. And 1 year of development down the line, we did a lot of pitching competitions, a lot of student startups do. We're very lucky to go to the McKinsey Venture Academy, for example, and also to Internet Plus in China. And then in 2019, we kind of went into stealth mode and really looked at the problem and really worked more on our solution hand in hand with a commercial third party. And we were really lucky that we had an exit with that company then earlier on this year. Can't really go more into it, as Carlos kind of alluded to the NDA there, but it was a great journey. And I just want to ask a couple of questions, maybe from founder's perspective. I think the first one I really have is, what was that trigger for you to take something that you've been researching so much and turn into a commercial product?
Sure, Dave. First of all, congratulations, Dave. Great your success story. One of our alumni. I'm very proud of you. It must have been your Trinity education, was it, that helped you?
Of course.
In my own case, well, I did my PhD, as Carlos mentioned, was in pharmacology. So I was always in the drug discovery business, really, inflammation, anti-inflammatories from the get-go, from my PhD on, really. And lots of my contemporaries would have gone into industry or would have gone into small startups. So I was very well aware of the whole business of biotech and, all that kind of. I went down the academic route because my passion was teaching, partly. I got to teach you, for example. But it was always in the back of my mind. I got some IP going, and then I had contracts with big pharma for a while, contract-based research with AstraZeneca, for example, one of my first contracts. But then I was approached actually by an entrepreneur, a guy called Mark Heffernan, who had set up a couple of companies himself. He had a PhD in biochemistry, he's a good science background, and he said, "I can form a company around your IP." And then we got a company called Opsona going. That was my first company. And that bombed, sadly, but you can't beat a bit of failure, as we all know. That didn't pan out in the end. But I learned a huge amount. I really enjoyed it. I got to know investors. That whole side of it kind of really got me. I mean, what got me most of all was how clever these people were, actually. You're working with some of the brightest people around. That was great, And then ideas began to percolate. And then finally we got to Inflazome. And that was a lucky break at some level. But But I knew the area inside out. Expertise is so important there, David, and I knew the inflammatory world absolutely inside out. And we stumbled into an inhibitor of that pathway. And I knew that was immediately commercializable. And me and this guy, Matt Cooper, he's a very important figure. He became the CEO of the company. And so, I kind of knew there was a big unmet need in these diseases. I knew it was a great target from my know-how. And then I find a molecule to block it. So it all kind of clicked into place based on that.
Yeah. I can imagine. And, I suppose for us, when we started a lot, because we weren't, I'm not a PhD student, don't have my PhD. So I was quite limited in terms of like the type of funding we could go for. And I think, there's a really interesting part that like, the government kind of plays in this, in providing supports for, science, focused entrepreneurs, but also just for entrepreneurs in general. But in this case, for science-focused entrepreneurs, do you think there's more, or the government could do, or do you see like any sticking points along that process, in terms of like helping get you to market? Because I feel like a lot don't really have that business side when they're starting off.
Yeah, I think the government has a certain role to play, but you got to get away from the government. Remember, with Opsona, we did get a seed grant initially. I think 30 grand or something came in. That kind of amount. We invested some of our own money, not a huge amount, to get it going. So you do need a bit of money to get started, I suppose. But then your deliverable in the first year is to raise money, let's face it. And then you haven't got too many options. VCs are the big option to go for. So you got to get to that pretty quick, I think, and get them on board. And then they've got hopefully connections and they can help the business grow. So that route is really important. It shouldn't be the government taking up all the sort of task here. That can't really work, I suppose. You could get money off a bank. That never works. So you got to pay it back. The other option is angels, but that can be tricky as well, in my experience, for other kinds of reasons. So I suppose the standard ecosystem is the government invests in basic research, and that they're getting tax off companies, say big pharma. Some of that should go back into basic research, and that's taxpayers' money because it's high risk. Remember, then you begin to get sort of other people involved in funding it, and venture capital isn't the risk, is it's still there, of course it is, and they might step in next. So there was kind of a gradual progression from state backing into private backing.
Okay. I suppose one of my final questions really is, with me, when we had this startup, I really started to enjoy the business side as time went on, really started to get a lot more involved in that during the progression of our company. I was wondering for you, did this, latest venture really, spark more of like the business interest in you? And like, can we expect to see that more of this from you in the future?
Anna, my passion is discovery, first and foremost. I'm a scientist. I am Captain Kirk on the Starship Enterprise. So discovery, I want to boldly go. Discovery, first and foremost, that turns me on by far, And part of my job as a teacher then is to bring that into my lectures, as you may remember. You want to get that in. So I am about discovery, first and foremost. But of course, I work in medically relevant area. I'm not stupid. I realize this could be useful. And then you've got a couple of options. You commercialize through a license maybe, or you form your own company. So it's a natural trajectory. I couldn't do it full time because it's very demanding. And as you know, the business side has all kinds of demands in it. And I do find it's satisfying, don't get me wrong, but I couldn't do it as a full-time job, I have to say. I do think it's an ecosystem. That word I've used maybe a few times now. You need the scientists and you need the business guys together. And they both bring different things to the table. They should overlap, though. It's great if the business guys have PhDs, for instance, or science degrees. That helps, because now you can sort of talk the same language. Equally, the science guys should have a knowledge of the business to make pitches to investors, how to describe the work to potential partners. That's a very important skill as well. So you need both. I've often said the most powerful people, maybe Carlos will disagree, but the most powerful have MBAs and PhDs, from Stanford, for example. But that's a deadly combination if because they've got both things going on then, really, So it's a very complicated thing. I mean, in my end of it, and you as well, David, to some extent, to discover a new medicine is a really difficult thing to do. It's probably the most difficult thing we can do as a species. Forget climbing Everest. Forget making the iPhone. That was easy, To make a new medicine is really difficult, for all kinds of reasons. It's intensely complex scientifically. When you get to the clinic, there's all kinds of hurdles to jump there. Safety, off-target effects. Maybe your whole pathogenic mechanism is wrong. And then you got to bring in the business development people. You got to bring in the lawyers. They're always involved as well, the patent attorneys. It's a huge ecosystem of people, And so when you get a success, then it's quite rare. But of course, the payday, if you're an investor, is massive if you make it. So there's and for good reason, because like our investors in Inflazome, they invested in us at risk. They gave us 55 million. That could have been gone, and they deserve a return on their investment. And then, by the way, getting back to the government idea, one of the investors in Fountain, one of our VCs, was the Irish government. You see, so governments can invest in venture capital as well, and many governments do this. You see, so the taxpayer did get some money back in the end as well, which is quite nice.
Great. Nice.
Right. To wrap things up, I'm going to ask you a few sort of fun questions, completely out there. One of them is one that I love to ask people that have a very macro view, as you do. And it's based upon how, as society, we look back and sometimes see things that we did and think, how did we let that happen? And an example of that would be something like, exploitations of the Aztecs and Mayan Indians with the conquistadors. We're like, oh man, or wiping out the Aborigines, in Australia. Yeah. And we look back and we're like, how did we let that happen, right? Now, if we fast forward 50 years in the future, and the caveat is from an immune point of view or from an inflammatory point of view, what is happening today that we will look back on 50 years from the future and think, from an inflammation point of view, how are we letting this happen?
Do you mean medically, Carlos, in a medical sense, or even
in a societal, like the thing that our society is doing to us that is generating inflammation or generating issues immunologically, that 50 years from now we'll be like, how the hell did we let that happen? How did we create this crisis?
Yeah. Well, no more than, if I can plug my book yet again, I have a chapter, the bullshit jobs chapter is a good example, right? So it's a shock to think that 50% of people are working in bullshit jobs, right? In other words, these jobs serve no function. I send you a memo, you send me one back. I have a Zoom call with you, and you have a Zoom call with me, and it goes on forever. And this guy, David Graeber, he was my inspiration for that. I read his book called Bullshit Job. Now, the reason why that's damaging is if a lot of our people on this earth are living under stressful situations, and I'm talking about mental health and psychological stress, that damages their immune system. There's no question. Most immunologists know this now in spades, and therefore they're getting sick, right? So human health is tied into well-being in the workplace, tied into a sense of fulfillment. In that chapter, I talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How could we have allowed centuries of enslavement? Now, it's a new kind of slavery now. The slaves now work for Google and Facebook, remember, if I can say that controversially. Now, I'm sure they're good employers as well. I'm not being totally negative. But we're going to look back and go, what was society did we have there that we were all these people doing worthless jobs, that was damaging their immune systems and giving them health problems that was then costing the economy all kinds of money anyway. So I think it's more a case of everybody has the potential to fulfill their true dreams. And that sounds unlikely, but every citizen has a right to do that. And the fact that we've enslaved people in different ways over the millennia, and that we're still doing that, we look back and go, how did we let that happen? And this is where the notion of the universal basic income comes in. It's not trivial to solve this by any means. But I do think we'll look back on that in 50 years' time and wonder, how do we run society the way we did?
Well, on that theme, what do you think will have to change in capitalism to prevent that and to prevent the overfishing and the overuse of natural resources that have finite amounts, but the stock market doesn't currently factor in as part of ongoing revenue growth?
It's very hard, isn't it, to answer that one? I think Star Trek, remember, the invention of the replicator did away with money. Okay, so in other words, you could make anything with the replicator and it didn't cost anything because the materials were recycling. So suddenly money disappears from society. Are we going to see a cashless society? Look what COVID's telling us that. I mean, I think what COVID is doing actually is it's bringing the future to the present in many ways, you see. So I think we're going. The only way it can shift is if the economic model that we've based the 20th century on and the 21st century is proven to be worthless to us. Let's put it that way, right? And at the moment, all we're doing is printing money. That seems to be working, doesn't it? So why don't we print loads of money, build loads of hospitals and schools and education, stop putting money into weapons, because the fear isn't attack from a foreign power I'm sure we're going to look back and go, why did we spend billions on armies that when there was never any real threat there? The threat came from a tiny virus that we didn't see coming. That took 100 trillion off the world economy. Not an attack from some force that was trying to invade us. So I think we are going to see a reconfiguring of the world order. Now, I'm not an economist. I wish they would answer as quickly, got us in that sense, But certainly the way society is changing fast now, it's going to be incredible, isn't it? I think we are going to invent the future in a much more positive way. Climate change is happening because of greed, largely. And it's also happening because we have to keep thinking of. Now, it is happening. The good news is the whole renewables area, we will go to nuclear fusion, watch, We are effectively inventing Star Trek, guys. That's what we're doing here in a sense, So let's speed up the process so they can make sure it comes more quickly than we'd ever dreamt of.
Well, maybe a last fun question, since you've mentioned Star Trek several times. Which is your favorite series and why?
Well,
your favorite captain, maybe even your favorite captain. Who's your favorite captain?
Well, my hero in Star Trek is Spock, the science officer. My dream would be to be the science officer on the Starship Enterprise. And then Data, of course, in the Next Generation. What a superb character, But Spock is the guy, right? I mean,
there's a hilarious interview if you really just have time to kill. Like, there's a hilarious interview on YouTube of I think it's called the Captain's Summit, and it's Kirk, Picard, and Spock, and number one, which I always forget his real name.
Yeah.
But
Will Riker.
Yeah, Will Riker, exactly. But the actor's name, I can't remember his name. But it's the four of them being interviewed by Whoopi Goldberg. Yeah. And it's a really funny anecdote that Spock says. He said, because I've had this image of being like the science officer, knowing everything science, that sometimes when he goes to schools and he goes and meets people, they start talking to him in their lingo, just thinking that as Spock, he gets it. And he's like, I'm just like, no idea. He's just an actor, right? But it's like he's so good at living that character that
my favorite, though, very brief, because in the Next Generation is my favorite, by the way. I think overall, the trouble with the first one is it's a bit clunky, isn't it? And Kirk is a bit like that, I love it, but so there's a great episode where Data falls in love, right? And he downloads every single piece of romantic fiction, all the Shakespeare plays. So he learns about love, and he thinks now he knows what to do on a date with his new girlfriend. And they're on their fourth date, and he picks a fight with her, and she gets all upset. She says, "What are you doing?" He says, "My algorithm tells me now's our time for our first lover's tip." He says, so you can't beat it, can you?
I love it. But actually, one thing I've always enjoyed, now that we're in just Star Trek fandom going on here, but one of the things that I've always loved about Star Trek is that it's always tackled a lot of issues earlier than they were actually kind of society could grapple with them. I think they were the first show to have a Black woman lead as part of the original Star Trek. But not only that, it's like tackling not only as you mentioned earlier, talking about economic challenges, but now, with the new series Discovery, I don't know if you're watching it on Amazon, I think it is. It's and the new Picard one. I don't know if you've seen that one too. Yeah. It's pretty good, and you see some of the themes, even how we interface with computers has changed over them.
Yeah,
and it's just interesting to see kind of if it's true, and it has been pretty good about showcasing future technologies. I'm curious to see what the future will bring.
I've always hated fantasy. I much prefer, the science fiction fantasy spectrum. That's just too stupid. The beauty of Star Trek was it could be true. You can imagine that's going to happen.
It is, and well, I'm so glad that I get to chat with you, who are probably setting the foundation for the next generation to really be inspired by all this. And clearly, as you can see from David, that's borne out well, and far more to come.
We need you, David. We need you.
So with that, Professor, thank you so much for joining us on this episode, and David as well. Thank you. Feel free to get in touch. We'll put some of the details for the professor and his book on the show notes. Until next time, guys. See you later.